asked, and I said, well, it was just like that when I went under. Because I was living in a time of a lot of communicable disease, flu, smallpox, and yellow fever. And I was to find out later in my life that that would shape part of my future, is the way that disease congregated in this area. So I'll tell you a little about myself, because frankly, I'm not terribly interesting, but my husband was. My husband was a doctor. And before he ever met me, he had already married his first wife, and that's her right there. And you know what? We had the same name. I think he was a very lazy man, and he did not want to be bothered learning two wives' names. So he just kept saying, "Oh,
no, he was just very bright. You're going to get in trouble if you have the same name."
That's the truth. But I was always very suspicious because he buried her right here. She was only 28 when she died. And then he buries me right next to him. He's not here. He's somewhere else. And you know who he's with? His third wife, who was my bridesmaid. All right, you're starting to smell around, aren't you? Okay, let's think about this. Look here. I died on Christmas morning. Christmas morning. And my husband, Walter, the town doctor, kept a diary about everything that was going on. Do you think he even mentions that I just died? No, he says the socks are too big and I don't like the tie. Not a word about his wonderful wife dying. So we don't know anything about the circumstances of my death. We don't know if I was sick or if I had an accident or anything else. It's just, your guess is as good as mine, but I do find it suspicious. 3 years after I die, he marries my bridesmaid. And they are not here. They're in Wilmington because she thought this was too ordinary and common a place for her. She's very pretentious. Not me. I'm a plain and simple girl. I come from Nova Scotia. My daddy was a preacher. And we had a very ordinary, plain life. I never had children. And I was married to Walter for 9.5 years. But Walter wrote a lot about himself, not so much about anybody else. So we don't know much about me, but we know a lot about Walter. And he turns out to be a pretty fascinating character. So even though I'm in front of my own grave, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Walter because he's an important person in how the history of Southport grew. Walter was born in New Hampshire, and he started college at Dartmouth. So he's in his freshman year at Dartmouth, and he runs out of money. His daddy calls him and says, we got no money. You're going to have to quit school. And he gets in touch with his sister, and he says, well, what are we going to do? And she says, well, I'm going to North Carolina to work as a governess. And he says, you know what, I think I'll tag along and see if I can find work. So they set off on a journey together. Now, because this highlights some of Walter, I'm going to tell you about the trip itself. They had to travel with gold because there was no common currency. So when they left one area, they had to get the currency of the next area and the area following that. They couldn't get a through ticket. They had to buy transit for each individual state because the railroad line wouldn't run them all the way through. So they finally make it to North Carolina, and the family that's hired the governess is thrilled. Oh, we're so glad you're here. And she said, oh, that's my brother Walter. And he goes, I don't know what we're going to do with him. She said, well, he plays piano, and he knows English, so maybe he could be a teacher too. So the gentleman who hired her farms him out to her neighbor. So Walter is working not far from his sister, so he sees her regularly while he's here, and he is thrilled with the money. He gets $20 a month, and he is a rich man at the end of the summer. He says, I now have enough money to go home to New Hampshire, finish my education, and I can travel in luxury. So Walter is 16, 17 years old. He packs up and heads back to New Hampshire, and he gets to Washington, D.C., and he says, you know, I've never really seen this. I'll get off the train and see what's going on. So he goes over to the White House. May I come in and talk to the president? Sure, come on in. He goes in and has a private audience with President Polk. And President Polk, who was from North Carolina, so there's some understanding here, says to him, tell me about what you've seen. What do you think of current events? What's happening where you live? And Walter gives him his opinion. It's a 16, 17-year-old kid in the house with the president telling him what to think. At the end of the meeting, Walter gets up. He said, I'd love to see what you've done with the place. He tours the whole White House. The rest of us can't even get on the ground. Can't even go to the ellipse anymore. But he tours the whole place. This tells you so much about Walter. He is a guy who is going to look at every opportunity and find the maximum way to use it. He is bold. He's not afraid of being rejected. And all through his life, these characteristics will mark who he is and what he accomplishes. Walter goes back to New Hampshire and becomes a doctor. Now, he's going to be about 21, 22 years old at this time. His training is sitting in the office with his own family doctor. And he says, I remember when I was 7 years old, you know how they would treat a patient? They would open up a wound and let them bleed. So he said, I can remember being 7 and thinking this ain't working. But there they go. That's what they're still doing. So Walter learns the techniques, and he comes down here, and the first thing he does is buy the medical practice, and he becomes the town doctor for everybody's needs at 21, 22 years old. And he quickly recognizes there are 2 things that are going to shape the way Southport develops: weather, disease. And he said, weather I can't do much about, but disease I can. And he recognized that while Southport, which was then called Smithville, wasn't being affected, Wilmington was being devastated by contagious disease. They lost 40% of the population to yellow fever. And he says yellow fever, typhoid, influenza, and smallpox. And I will tell you what he said in his diary. If they'd been vaccinated, they didn't die of smallpox. I don't know where you might hear that elsewhere. At any he tells them, he says, we've got to do something because these diseases are coming in from ships. The ships are coming through here. Now, they don't stop in Smithville. Nobody gets off the ship because there's nothing here. So we're not getting anywhere near the results. They're going up to Wilmington, get off the ship, spread the disease, half the population dies. So he said, build a quarantine station. If you've ever taken the ferry, you see a big concrete platform out there. That is the base of the quarantine station. And Walter, with his vision, designed the station, promoted it, got the money for it, oversaw the building, and he got federal funding to build it. And when it was ready to open, the federal government said, we don't want you, we want one of our own people. So Walter, who had been the whole driving force behind the quarantine station, had done all the work, at the last minute has the authority to become the quarantine officer on the station ripped from him. And he loses that position, and this affects him for the rest of his life. Now, he is still the mayor, he is a city councilman, he remains the town doctor until his death in 1909, and he becomes involved in 2 other projects, which if you talk to Kate Stewart, she takes credit for them too, but Kate and he both felt that the name Smithville was a flat line. Nobody's gonna come to Smithville. However, if we called it something cool, like Southport, they might stop and they'll think of us as a destination because the word port will just highlight. And we need the railroad. If we don't have the railroad here, we can't get goods here, we can't offload here. People are never going to use this as a port. So he promoted both the railroad, which was opened in 1911, 2 years after his death. He doesn't even get mentioned at the ceremony. He is not even mentioned in passing, and he has done all the work to bring it here. And the name change, which he did live to see. So he saw it become Southport. He is, I think he is one of the great visionaries of the late 19th century, and he helped mold the city that we have now. he isn't buried here because his pretentious wife Maggie insisted that they be buried in the upscale cemetery in Wilmington. So I'm here with his first wife and his daddy. We didn't have any children, so his 3 children are also with him in Wilmington. And I appreciate you stopping by to see me. I don't get out that much. Once a year is plenty. Somebody told me they wanted my autograph, and I said, you know, I don't believe I know how to write. I think it's just an S. I bet you can write better than I could. Yeah.